Welcome to a series where we're going to talk about short game, wedge play in general, cover some of the things, some of the myths, some of the anecdotal things that people do, but hopefully start to give you a better grasp on it. Over the last few years, short game's probably had a bit of a battering. A lot of the data shows us that full swing, long game is more influential to score, but where short game can be really good is, one, it can give you confidence in taking on a strategy because you know you can get away with things. Two, I think it certainly helps breed a lot of understanding of how the ball and the club react to each other and how you put control into that. So what we're going to kind of try and go through is give you a better understanding of what you can and can't do, how you individualise it, and therefore how you can build a game that's going to help with your scoring. One thing I'm going to try and not do as much as possible is preach a method. There's lots and lots of really good stuff out there, whether it's from Dave Peltz, James Ridyard, John Seatman, Joe Leeds, all these lots of really great, you see somebody like Brett Rumford out on tour, extremely good short game players. And you actually see a lot of adaptation that they do, so they don't necessarily have this is how we swing it, to a certain extent. We look at DeChambeau, if any of you read The Golfing Machine, when he's here, he's got this kind of pivot point, pressure points, making things happen. It's a method, and he even within that varies. So what we've got to try and find is help you find the things that you can work with, how you can make the play. So your first thing really is the understanding how important the equipment is. So if you're playing with, first mistake, using a dodgy range ball, so two-piece Surling covered golf ball, and let's be honest, most of us have got at least 2, maybe 3-year-old wedges in our bag. That will prevent some shots being viable for you. So if you've got a Surling covered golf ball, it can't interact with the face as much as an older golf ball could. Sorry, a urethane or elastomer covered golf ball could. The older wound Balata balls interacted with the face very, very well. They spun up like no one's business. Made it very difficult to get in the air initially, and made a knockout shape, and there was a bit of a payoff in distance. The modern two-piece ball gives you that straighter distance, makes the ball want to take off quite high, but when it wants to take off high, it means it's spent a bit more time on the club face, come off with a bit less spin. Now that, once you know that as a limitation, that's something you can play with. But if you don't know that that's what you've got to play with, if you're trying to spin your Titleist DT or your Strixon AD3 or your Callaway Warbird, if you're trying to spin that ball, it's going to be incredibly difficult to spin it with any sort of consistency. The club you use, tour players obviously change their wedges incredibly frequently, some as a matter of weeks between. Somebody like Tiger will get his fresh wedges and have full practice sessions with them to wear the faces slightly so he doesn't get an absolute brand new club spin. But once you've been playing, the average golfer playing golf for around about a year, they will have lost a pretty significant amount of the spin on that wedge. So they will kind of, particularly something above 50 degrees. So most of the companies will say, if you're playing competitive golf, you should probably be changing your 50 and above clubs, or above 50 clubs at least every 18 months. Anything that's a little kind of 48 to 50, probably every 2 years, because you're going to see this drop off in spin, which is going to then make that shot unpredictable. Again, if you understand that, and it's a limitation, it's something you can play with. But certainly if you're somebody who's trying to play those shots, as much as technique is half the equation. Half the equation is the right sort of golf ball and a fresh, clean golf club. You've got if it's full of dirt and mud and water and all that on it, and we'll kind of cover that, we'll talk about that. So that's the first part of the equation. The second part becomes that technical part, how we move it, how we get the these contact points on the club become important. What loft we use. There's still a lot of the old wives' tales of, you know, play it back in the stands and stand way open and wait and try and hit shots that way, or even, you know, take a 7-iron and play it back in the stands and stab it forward. Two issues really crop up from that. The first one is a modern 7-iron isn't a 7-iron, it's probably closer to a 5-iron really. Modern pitching wedge, you know, is now 42, 43 degrees in many cases, some is nearly into the 30s. As opposed to when I started playing, 50-degree pitching wedge was the norm. You had a pitching wedge and a sand wedge. So if you're going into this old idea, oh yeah, I'll just take this club and this will run it up. If you're chipping with a 7-iron now, it's going to hit the ground very, very early because there's not a lot of loft there, and it's going to come off very fast. Now that could be a real issue. So certainly if you're chipping with those straighter face clubs, you're afraid to use the more lofted clubs. The more lofted clubs aren't as lofted as they used to be, with the exception of your sand wedges and above. And these your 8s, 9s are all quite strong now. So play with those. The other thing is that thought of ball back and kind of making that happen became from the fact that we were using this higher spinning, softer core ball. Now the balls are very different. So that idea, and some players still play exceptionally well with that, can be a little bit of an issue to work through. So the first thing I want to get you thinking about is concept of your shot, understanding of what you need the ball to do, and getting the visual of that in your mind. Now this is something that's the same for any golf shot I would hit. Around the greens, I'm always thinking, can I get the ball to land on the flat? So here I've got like a little 25-yard shot. So if I was practicing out here, I'd be thinking about, right, I want to land the ball on that spot, getting used to landing on a flat spot. If the nearest flat spot was at the bottom of this slope here, I'd be landing it there. A flat spot's predictable. If I'm hitting into an upslope, I could miss it, I could go in really hard and it stops, I could find it comes back, vice versa on a down. This is relatively predictable. If I can control the ball coming in, it's going to be predictable when it lands on that flat area. That's my first thing. Well, dips can be quite playable because again, if you land it a bit short, it'll kick on, and if you land into it, it'll pop up. But more often than not, it might be you start thinking, well, the flats all the way up by the flag. Okay, it's going to be a big shot. Flats 3 foot in front of me. It's going to be an easier shot. So then you can use the ground conditions. The second thing, and this comes for me from probably my favourite player, Sevi, you'd often see him, he'd get to his ball and he'd just stood there, swinging his arm. He was imagining throwing the ball with his trail hand, imagine having that ball in his hand, throw it. Now, if I have that ball in my hand, the movement of my trail arm is very similar, going to be at a very similar speed to how I would play the shot, whether it's a low running shot, a high lofted shot, but it's getting that into my mind. That's something we instinctively do. Most of us haven't been taught how to throw, we just evolve it, we do it. So think of the shot in that way, getting up there, think of the throwing ball, that gives it in your mind, right, I'm going to throw it to that spot, how fast am I going to move my arms, how am I going to start my body position, how much is my trail hand going to actually work in the swing, because you kind of think, well, if I'm going to just throw it along the ground, straight away there's very little movement of my trail hand. If I'm going to hit a big higher one, yes, there's more movement, but it's probably not as extreme or as violent as people have often thought. So that's our building blocks. Get the equipment good, make sure you understand the limitations of that. You know, whatever you decide you need to play with, you might not want to be playing with that premium golf ball. You might think, oh, I want to play the cheaper one for lots and lots of good reasons. You'll understand those limitations because that allows you to play your game. Then get that thoughts in your mind of where you actually are trying to, what sort of shot are you trying to play. By looking at flat spots, you can start to decide a lot more of how you're going to play